Killian stood just outside the cell, his breath steady but his mind in turmoil. The cold air of the stone fortress wrapped around him like a weight, pressing in on his chest. His gaze fell on Lori, the young woman he had been ordered to guard. She sat by the small window, her figure bathed in the faint, silvery light that filtered through the narrow bars. Every time he saw her, something in his gut twisted, something he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. She didn't belong here, in this cold, damp cell beneath the fortress. She was a daughter of a rival kingdom's leader, taken as leverage in the war, a pawn in the king's relentless hunger for power. But to Killian, she wasn't just a tool of war. The longer he spent guarding her, the harder it became to see her as anything but a woman trapped in a cage she didn't deserve. Her long, curly hair framed her face in soft waves, and he could see the tension in her body, even as she sat in silence. Her back was straight, her hands resting in her lap, though her fingers would occasionally twitch, as if her mind was far from this place. She stared out the small window, her expression unreadable, an outward mask of calm, but he knew better. He had spent enough time watching her to notice the subtle signs of her inner turmoil. The way her lips pressed together just a little too tight. The quick, shallow breaths she tried to control. She had been here for weeks, and every day, Killian watched her struggle with the weight of her captivity. He had seen the strength in her, how she refused to break despite the hopelessness of her situation. He admired that. No, he respected it. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere between the first days of guarding her and now, something had shifted inside him. At first, he had told himself it was just his job. Guard the prisoner, follow orders, keep his distance. He had done it countless times before with other captives, never once letting his emotions get involved. But this time was different. Every time he stood here, he found himself drawn to her, as if there was something more pulling him in. She was a prisoner, yes, but she wasn't a criminal. She wasn't some enemy combatant who deserved this fate. He could hear the faint sounds of life beyond the fortress walls, distant footsteps of soldiers, the occasional clang of metal on metal. But here, in this corridor, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. The silence between them had grown familiar, comfortable even, though today it felt heavier than usual. Killian shifted on his feet, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. The cool leather of the grip was a grounding reminder of his duty. But today, the weight of that duty felt like a burden. He was supposed to be a soldier. He had been trained to obey without question, to follow orders no matter how difficult. But as he stood there, watching Lori in the pale light, he couldn't ignore the growing doubt gnawing at him. Why did it matter to him what happened to her? Why did he care if she stayed in that cell or not? Because you've seen her, whispered a voice in the back of his mind. You've seen her strength, her resilience, her fear. She's more than just a prisoner. Killian clenched his jaw, forcing the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to think like that. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. And yet, despite his best efforts, he found himself stepping closer to the bars. Are you going to stand there all day? Lori's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. Killian froze, surprised by her sudden question. He hadn't expected her to speak, and the sound of her voice startled him more than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I'm here to guard you, he replied, his tone gruff, though it lacked the usual sharpness he used to mask his unease. It's my job. Lori's gaze remained fixed on the window for a moment longer before she turned her head to look at him. Her eyes, deep green and intense, met his with a steady focus that made his chest tighten. She didn't say anything at first, just studied him, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. You're not like the others, she said finally, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. Killian stiffened. You don't know me. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but it was more sad than amused. I know enough. He wanted to protest, to tell her she didn't know anything about him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, his hand tightening on his sword, as if it could anchor him to the duty he was supposed to uphold. But in that moment, all the training, all the years of following orders, felt like they meant nothing. Lori turned her body slightly, facing him more fully now. "Why do you follow him?" she asked, her voice still soft, but there was a challenge in her eyes. "Why do you serve a king who does this?" Killian's jaw clenched. He wasn't sure how to answer that. It was a question he had avoided asking himself for a long time. Loyalty, duty, those were the things that had defined him for years. He had never questioned them, until now. "Because I don't have a choice," he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "There's always a choice," Lori replied, her gaze unwavering. "You just have to decide if you're willing to make it." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Killian's mind raced, grappling with the weight of what she was saying. Was she right? Could he make a different choice? He had spent so long following orders that he had forgotten what it felt like to make his own decisions. But as he stood here, face to face with Lori, he realized that he had already started to make that choice. The very fact that he cared what happened to her meant that something inside him had changed. He took a step closer to the bars, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "And what about you?" he asked. "Do you think you have a choice?" Lori's expression softened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm not going to stop fighting for one." Her words struck something deep within him. She hadn't given up, even in the face of her captivity. She hadn't let the darkness of this place consume her. Killian found himself admiring her strength even more, and with that admiration came something more dangerous, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. The silence stretched between them, but there was no time to dwell. They had already escaped, making their way through the fortress and now out into the quiet of the night. Killian had taken her hand, and together, they had slipped into the shadows, navigating the secret passageways he had used many times before. Now, standing at the edge of the kingdom, they were free. Lori's hand still in his, they faced the forest ahead, dark, mysterious, but full of possibilities. "What now?" Lori asked, her voice a soft whisper, filled with both hope and uncertainty. Killian squeezed her hand gently, his gaze steady as he looked at her. "Now, we start over. Together." Lori smiled, a real, genuine smile, for the first time in what felt like forever. And with that, they disappeared into the mist of the forest, leaving the kingdom and their old lives behind. Like, subscribe, and share message. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the captive's escape. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this channel with others who love stories of tension, emotion, and deep connection. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I look forward to bringing you even more captivating tales. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our story collection. Thank you again for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.